Welcome to New York City. Do you recognize this road? If you've ever been in the city for long, you've most likely traveled along the FDR. And this bridge should look pretty familiar. And this tunnel. And chances are you recognize these images. What you might not know is that everything you're seeing is the direct result of one massive series of reforms designed to pull this country out of the Great Depression, the New Deal. To uncover the story behind this vast project, we have to go back many decades to the year 1929. In the 1920s, the economy appeared to be booming. People buying stocks were taking bigger and bigger risks because it seemed as though nothing could go wrong. On the surface, it was an era of confidence and optimism that led some people to invest heavily in the stock market, along with making many other risky economic choices.
Always plenty to do and see in the big town. Ride the elevated train, all the way from the Battery far uptown. Great ocean liners along the Hudson River. Mighty tall buildings in New York City. Look at that traffic on Fifth Avenue.
Then, on October 29, 1929,
the tremendous crowds which you see gathered outside the stock exchange are due to the greatest crash in the history of the New York Stock Exchange in market prices.
Though the crash was not the sole cause of the Depression, it revealed the faults in the economy that had been growing unchecked throughout the preceding decade. Once the Great Depression had begun, the whole country was sent into economic turmoil, marked by bank closures and unemployment and foreclosure. Many wondered whether the country's feeble economy would ever recover. The first sign of hope came with the election of Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1932. Immediately after gaining office, he began a series of federal reform programs that became known as the New Deal.
I pledge myself to a new deal for the American people.
A year later in New York City, a mayoral election had just taken place to determine who could be trusted to lead the city during the Depression. The winner, Fiorello LaGuardia, was a reformer and a fighter for the people. LaGuardia's success as a reformer was not just due to the Great Depression, but was in a large part thanks to the discrediting of Jimmy Walker and the rest of Tammany Hall, which made the public ready for a change in leadership. A Republican, LaGuardia ran for mayor on the Fusion ticket, a coalition of political parties, in order to appeal across party lines in such a heavily Democratic city. But though LaGuardia was a Republican, he was in fact good friends with President Roosevelt, a Democrat, a relationship that would prove quite useful in the coming months and years. When campaigning for mayor, he declared that his main goal was to fight to restore the city to the people by throwing out the corrupt politicians, that this was the only way of rescuing and saving the city. He fought most strongly against the corruption of Tammany Hall.
This is a fight against a cruel, vicious, greedy political machine.
He believed that principles of good administration and the elimination of corruption could overcome New York City's inheritance of the Depression. He once described his vision of what he hoped the future held for the city, saying, "Sometimes I see the city of tomorrow, with marvelous parks and buildings, finer hospitals, safer and more beautiful streets, better schools, more playgrounds, more swimming pools, greater markets. There are fewer prisons, too, because there will be less incentive for crime. I see a city with no slums and little poverty. It will be a reality someday." One key reason for LaGuardia's popularity with the people of New York City was that he was seen as the ultimate New Yorker himself. He could identify with many different types of people because he was the child of a Jewish mother and an Italian father. He was born in Lower Manhattan, but raised in Arizona and Italy. He was an Episcopalian and spoke 7 different languages fluently. A result of his diverse appeal was that he had a greater connection with his people than perhaps any mayor before. From the beginning, people noticed that he seemed to be everywhere at once. He showed up at car accidents and train wrecks and fires, transformed his limousine into a mobile office so that he could be constantly moving throughout the city and staying up to date on whatever was taking place that day. He was even a guest conductor of the city orchestra at Carnegie Hall. LaGuardia demanded a seemingly impossible level of commitment from his staff, but even more from himself. He took no vacations for years, even when they were suggested. He involved himself in the day-to-day operations of the city's departments, never afraid to take a hands-on approach to topics he was passionate about. For example, LaGuardia despised gambling and anything related to it, so he demonstrated to the public what he believed should be done with all slot machines.
In New York City, the Little Flower was on an anti-gambling rampage. Gotham's colorful Mayor LaGuardia led police in smashing and jettisoning 1,200 slot machines. Mechanical pickpockets, Fiorello called them. He aimed the first one into Long Island Sound personally. No more slot machines, he said, and made it stick.
Because LaGuardia created such a personal connection with his people, he was very conscious of the unemployment levels affecting the city. As the son of 2 immigrant parents, he made an effort to fight for immigrants and ethnic minorities, believing in equal opportunities for the citizens of New York, a city with a much larger number of poor immigrants than most other cities in the country. Before the crash, the mayor once said that while others were watching the stock market go up, he was instead watching unemployment go up. He was continually fighting for those who hadn't benefited from the prosperity of the 20s, yet were still suffering through the hardships of the Depression, believing it was the government's duty to help those unable to fight for themselves.
To the idea that American citizens who through no fault of their own are unable to find work have the right to be provided work so that they can support their families decently and properly.
But first, the city administration had to be cleaned up, and the corruption in the government had to be replaced with honesty. LaGuardia immediately fired tens of thousands of people who had gained their positions through deals made with Tammany Hall. He declared that his administration would consist of those hired based on merit rather than patronage. Desiring the best of the best, he opened the job search to encompass the entire country, not just New York City. LaGuardia refused to stand for any sort of political favoritism. Therefore, within just a few months, the city's long-standing acceptance of corruption had been replaced by LaGuardia's demand for transparency and integrity. LaGuardia believed that the most important industry for the recovery of New York's economy was that of construction. The city's physical infrastructure desperately needed to be rebuilt and expanded. His vision involved putting thousands of men to work building roads and bridges and tunnels, creating parks and public housing. But an issue arose as LaGuardia was developing his ideas. The plan seemed overly ambitious, almost absurdly so, for the circumstances. The city was $2 billion in debt. The federal government was offering little to no money for assistance, and the usual resources that New York had always counted on, money from the wealthy individuals in society such as brokers, manufacturers, and bankers, was no longer available. But LaGuardia refused to be discouraged. While other mayors were begging their governors for money to give to their unemployed as short-term fixes, and the governors were repeating these appeals to the president, LaGuardia was looking for lasting, more permanent solutions for recovery. He once said, "A mayor who cannot look 50 or 75 years into the future is not worthy of being in City Hall." Though his forward-thinking plans would be greatly beneficial to the city, he did not have anywhere close to enough resources to implement them. But his perseverance paid off with FDR's implementation of New Deal programs such as the Public Works Administration, the PWA, and the Civil Works Administration, the CWA. By the end of 1934, New Deal initiatives such as these were pouring billions of dollars into the country. Thanks in a large part to LaGuardia, New York City received a disproportionate amount of federal relief funding. First, LaGuardia's reputation for trustworthiness assured the federal government that the money they sent would reach its intended target. In other cities, funds were known to diminish greatly as they passed through the municipal government, just as they would have done in New York's Tammany Hall days. But after LaGuardia's overhaul of the city's administration, everyone seemed to agree that New York was surprisingly free from political influence and corruption. Perhaps the most pivotal advantage New York had over other cities was that its mayor had such a close relationship with the president. LaGuardia frequently flew down to the White House to get FDR to personally increase the amount of money New York received from the government. As a result of LaGuardia's ability to bypass the typical bureaucratic structures when obtaining funds, over 20% of the $1 billion allocated to the Civil Works Administration was channeled into New York City, and around 1/7 of all spending by the Works Progress Administration was in New York as well. The reason that this system between LaGuardia and President Roosevelt worked so well was that both sides received something they needed. On the mayor's side, he was given desperately needed relief funds, and on the president's side, FDR wanted those funds to be spent quickly and in a highly visible way, so that the country could see that his programs were effective. Finally, LaGuardia had a way of funding his dream of long-term and large-scale public works projects that would transform the city. But he still needed someone to work out the details of his plans, to be in charge of the finer points, and to assure that the jobs were completed correctly and on time. LaGuardia found that very person within Robert Moses, a builder of public works often called the master builder of New York City. Over several decades of work, Moses transformed almost every aspect of the city. At the very beginning of his term, LaGuardia hired Moses as his city parks commissioner. Moses began work immediately because, as he recalled, after the neglect of Tammany Hall, the parks were in disgraceful condition. He hired 600 unemployed architects and engineers who gathered a construction force of 80,000 previously unemployed men. Moses later stated that the workers he inherited from the former administration were working with no plans or supervision, an issue he immediately rectified. After a long winter in 1934, the citizens of New York City entered the parks to discover that a complete transformation had happened in just a few months. 17,000 projects had been completed by Moses. Lawns were reseeded, tennis courts resurfaced, structures were repainted, 11,000 new trees were planted, and 38 miles of walks were repaved. Thanks to a combination of New Deal funding and LaGuardia's persistence, Moses transformed almost every aspect of the city. One of his most famous projects was the building of the Triborough Bridge, which he did with almost entirely PWA money.
In 1936, workmen hurried to complete the new Triborough Bridge by a July 11th deadline. The engineers and workmen met the schedule. On July 11, 1936, the new Triborough Bridge opened officially to the public, and the Triborough Authority began its unparalleled record of progress in arteries, crossings, parks, and other improvements for New York City. A large crowd gathered that hot July day at the newly built Municipal Stadium on Randall's Island, where President Franklin Delano Roosevelt made the formal dedication. And thousands upon thousands of people crossed the Triborough Bridge for the first time. Many of them walked across, for not as many people owned cars in those days.
But among his other achievements, he built an impressive system of 13 bridges and several tunnels, which connected to 416 miles of expressways and parkways. He also constructed 658 playgrounds, remodeled or created countless parks, such as Central Park, which he remade into the park we know today after it had undergone years of neglect, and Bryant Park, his own creation. Though Moses's work was the center of LaGuardia's reform program in New York, receiving the most New Deal money, LaGuardia had many other New Deal projects going on around the city. First, in response to the awful housing situation in slums, LaGuardia promised,
I shall seek to obtain federal funds for slum clearance to be rented at low rates within the means of small wage earners.
Within a few years, he had followed through with his promise.
Another New Deal project was the first low-income municipal housing on New York's Lower East Side, notorious for its crime and disease-breeding slums. Mrs. Roosevelt officially opened the new homes, with Governor Lehman and Mayor LaGuardia looking on.
As the mayor was so in tune with his people, he was aware of the great problems facing the school system. To save money, Tammany Hall had fired 11,000 teachers, overwhelming those still employed by the city. At the same time, many children were dropping out of school to get jobs, to provide a much-needed source of income for their struggling families. A lack of child labor laws allowed children to find work in harsh conditions such as factories. He heard teachers complain that the children who did come to school couldn't even fit into the downsized classrooms. Without proper funding, many schools could no longer provide hot lunches, leaving the students hungry. But LaGuardia did not only blame the Depression for the issues with the school system. He determined that this problem was a side effect of the corruption that had existed within the previous administrations.
By an honest system of contracting, let all the money of the taxpayers go into schools instead of politicians.
When fighting to get children back into classrooms, he and his administration had hoped to get 180,000 students into the system. But they ended up being so successful that they surpassed their goal by 8,000 students. Thanks to LaGuardia's success in ridding the city of corruption, New Deal funds were now free to go straight to the schools. LaGuardia also used New Deal money to build hospitals and highways, colleges and healthcare centers, an integrated mass transit system, including new subways. To keep New York at the forefront of technology, LaGuardia insisted that the city build the best airport in the world. The WPA funded murals that decorated the city, and federal arts projects, and theater projects, all to keep the artists employed and productive. The World's Fair was held in the city in 1939, designed by Robert Moses, featuring events from around the world. An impressive achievement for a city that only a decade before had been struggling to keep the lights on in City Hall. Though the Great Depression may have ended many years ago, the lasting effects of the New Deal in New York City can still be seen today. The most important change is arguably the physical unification of the 5 boroughs that make up New York City. Through bridges, tunnels, and highways, New York's New Deal did more for connecting the boroughs than anything in the 4 preceding decades. Structures constructed during the Depression that are still standing today remain a lasting testament to the New Deal and the efforts put into pulling the city out of the Depression. In a large part thanks to Mayor Fiorello LaGuardia's careful planning, eradication of corruption, and skilled hiring of professionals such as Robert Moses, as well as his partnership with FDR, the structures built as a result of New Deal programs were built to serve countless future generations of New Yorkers.